The kitchen knife moved through the onion with surgical precision, each slice exactly 3 millimeters thick. Samuel Martinez, though everyone at the Red Rock Trading Post simply called him Cookie, had been preparing the evening stew when the sound of spurs and cruel laughter drifted through the batwing doors. His weathered hands, marked by decades of scars that most folks assumed came from kitchen accidents, never paused in their methodical work. The main room of the Trading Post fell silent except for the scrape of chair legs against wooden floors as patrons suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Cookie had heard that particular brand of silence before, in cavalry camps when Comanche war parties were spotted on the horizon. He set down his knife and wiped flour-dusted fingers on his stained apron, listening. Heavy boots thundered across the plank floor. Bull Morrison's voice boomed through the thin walls separating the kitchen from the main room, rough as sandpaper and twice as abrasive. The man demands everything for free, Cookie thought, watching steam rise from the pot of rabbit stew he'd been tending since dawn. Before we continue with what happened next, I'm curious where you're listening from. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're in. These frontier stories seem to travel everywhere, and I love seeing how tales of standing up to bullies resonate across the world. Clara Whitman, barely 19, and working at the Trading Post to support her younger siblings after their parents died of fever, pushed through the kitchen door with tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. Her calico dress was torn at the shoulder where rough hands had grabbed her, and her auburn hair had escaped its careful bun. Cookie never looked up from his cutting board where he'd moved on to carrots, but his voice carried the gentle tone he reserved for frightened animals and younger folk. Don't you worry about them boys, Clara. They'll get their fill and move on. She shook her head, wrapping thin arms around herself. They're not paying, Cookie. Bull says the territory belongs to him now, and that includes everything in it, including me, if I don't watch myself. The knife paused for just a heartbeat before resuming its steady rhythm. Cookie's pale blue eyes, faded like winter sky, but still sharp as flint, never left his work. How many of them are there? 6, counting Bull. They've got iron on their hips and meanness in their hearts. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. They're saying they own everything from here to Deadwood Gulch. Anyone who doesn't pay tribute gets burned out. Cookie had seen men like Bull Morrison before. Usually they ended up feeding buzzards on some forgotten stretch of prairie, but not before they'd hurt a lot of innocent folks. The old cook's hands, which had been trembling slightly from what everyone assumed was age, grew perfectly steady as he sectioned the carrots with mathematical precision. The kitchen door exploded inward, hanging crooked on its leather hinges. Bull Morrison filled the doorframe like a mountain of meat and malice. 6 feet 4 inches of unwashed outlaw, dressed in a black leather vest over a red flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His beard was the color of dried blood, and his eyes held the flat, lifeless quality of a man who'd killed for pleasure more than profit. Behind him crowded his gang. Skinny Pete Rodriguez, all elbows and nervous energy, fingers dancing near his twin colts. Jake Thornton, built like a whiskey barrel with arms like tree trunks. Frank Gunner, the baby of the group at maybe 22, trying to look as hard as his older companions. Tommy Brennan, whose scarred face told the story of too many barroom brawls. And bringing up the rear, Charlie Vance, whose reputation with a rifle had made him valuable enough to overlook his cowardice in close quarters. Well, Bull's voice rumbled through the small kitchen. What have we got here? The old woman's in the kitchen, playing with his little knives. Cookie continued his methodical vegetable preparation, not looking up. Evening, gentlemen. Stew will be ready in about an hour if you'd care to wait in the main room. Clara can bring you some bread and butter to tide you over. Bull's laughter was like rocks tumbling down a cliff face. Oh, we're not waiting for nothing, old man. And we ain't paying neither. This here territory belongs to me now, and that means everything in it comes free of charge. The gang spread out behind their leader, hands resting on gun butts with practiced casualness. Clara pressed herself against the far wall, trying to become invisible. Cookie finally looked up from his cutting board, and for just a moment, Bull Morrison caught something in those pale blue eyes that made his grin falter. I'm afraid that's not how commerce works, son, Cookie said mildly. Folks work for what they eat around here. But I tell you what, seeing as you boys look like you've been riding hard, I'll give you the first bowl on the house. After that, it's 2 bits a serving, same as everyone else. Bull's face darkened like a thundercloud building over the mountains. You telling me no, old man? Cookie returned to his vegetables, the knife moving through a potato with effortless precision. I'm telling you how things work at the Red Rock Trading Post. Always have, always will. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Bull Morrison's hand shot out, grabbing the edge of Cookie's large soup pot and sending it crashing to the floor. 20 gallons of carefully prepared stew splashed across the kitchen, filling the air with the smell of wasted food and ruined work. Clara gasped. Cookie stared down at the mess, his knife still poised above the cutting board. When he looked back up, something had changed in his expression. The mild-mannered cook was still there, but underneath lurked something else entirely. That was 3 hours' work you just destroyed, Cookie said quietly, and food that would have fed this community tonight. Bull Morrison threw back his head and laughed, his gang joining in like a pack of coyotes. Old man, where I come from, wasting food is the least of what happens to folks who don't show proper respect. Maybe you need a lesson in manners. Maybe I do, Cookie agreed, setting down his knife with deliberate care. But not from you, son. Not from you. Bull Morrison stepped deeper into the kitchen, his boots squelching through the spilled stew. The gang followed like shadows, filling the small space with unwashed bodies and the metallic smell of gun oil. Cookie remained perfectly still, hands resting flat on the cutting board beside his knife. I don't think you heard me proper, old man, Bull continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. This territory belongs to me now. That means your food, your supplies, and anything else I might fancy, including that pretty little thing cowering in the corner. Clara's breath hitched, but Cookie's expression never changed. He began wiping his hands on his apron with methodical slowness. You boys are welcome to purchase a meal and move on. That's the extent of my hospitality. Bull's massive hand swept across Cookie's carefully organized spice rack, sending jars of oregano, black pepper, and precious salt crashing to the floor. The glass shattered like miniature explosions, mixing their contents with the pooled stew in a brown, aromatic mess. How about now, grandfather? Bull sneered. You changing your tune yet? Cookie surveyed the destruction with the same calm he might use to examine a burnt biscuit. Those spices came all the way from Santa Fe. Cost me a month's wages. He looked up at Bull with those pale blue eyes that seemed to hold winter itself. That was unnecessary, son. The lady's frightened enough. The gang erupted in laughter. Skinny Pete slapped his knee and hooped. Frank Gunner made exaggerated trembling motions with his hands. Jake Thornton grabbed a remaining jar of cinnamon and hurled it against the wall just to watch it explode. Look at him, boys, Bull roared with amusement. The old fool thinks he's giving us orders. What's next, Cookie? You gonna spank us with that there wooden spoon? Despite the chaos, Cookie moved to his stove and began ladling what remained of a smaller pot of beans into wooden bowls. His movements were steady, professional, as if 6 armed men weren't destroying his kitchen around him. The beans steamed in the cool evening air, filling the room with the honest smell of simple food. Here's what I can offer you, Cookie said, setting the bowls on a wooden tray. Beans, cornbread from this morning, and coffee that's still hot. No charge, seeing as you're clearly desperate. Then you can ride on and trouble someone else. Bull Morrison's face went purple with rage. The old man's calm was starting to unnerve him, though he'd never admit it. He'd seen plenty of men beg, cry, fight, or run when faced with the Morrison gang. He'd never seen anyone offer them dinner. You got some stones, old-timer, Bull admitted, then deliberately knocked the tray from Cookie's hands. The bowls shattered against the floor, adding beans and broken pottery to the growing mess. But stones don't stop bullets. Cookie watched his food join the ruins of his kitchen. A muscle in his jaw twitched once, so briefly that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed. When he bent to start cleaning up the mess, his movements had changed subtly. The tremor in his hands was gone completely, and he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. From the main room came the sound of more destruction. Tommy Brennan and Charlie Vance had apparently decided to help themselves to the trading post's inventory. Glass bottles shattered as they sampled the whiskey. Furniture scraped across floors as they searched for anything valuable. Clara whimpered as a particularly loud crash echoed through the walls. The sound seemed to snap something inside Bull Morrison. His eyes fixed on her like a hawk spotting a rabbit, and his cruel mouth split into a grin. "You know what, boys," Bull said, never taking his eyes off Clara. "I think we've been going about this all wrong. Maybe the old cook needs some proper motivation to be more hospitable." He took a step toward Clara, who pressed herself harder against the wall, as if she could somehow disappear into the wood itself. Her green eyes were wide with terror, and her hands shook as she tried to smooth her torn dress. "Leave her be," Cookie said quietly, not looking up from where he knelt gathering broken pottery. "She's got nothing to do with this." Bull ignored him completely, advancing on Clara with predatory slowness. The girl tried to slide along the wall toward the door, but Jake Thornton moved to block her path. She was trapped between them, breathing so fast she was nearly hyperventilating. "Pretty little thing, ain't you?" Bull murmured, reaching out to touch Clara's cheek. "Bet you'd be real friendly if someone asked you nice." Clara jerked her head away from his touch, and Bull's expression darkened. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, yanking her away from the wall. She stumbled, nearly falling, and let out a small cry of pain and fear. That was when Cookie stood up. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The stooped shoulders straightened slightly. The shuffling gait became more balanced, and those pale blue eyes grew cold as January frost. "Let her go," Cookie said, his voice carrying a quality that made every man in the room look at him. "Last chance I'm asking politely." Bull Morrison had Clara's wrist in a grip that was sure to leave bruises. He looked at Cookie and saw what appeared to be a skinny old man in a flour-stained apron, holding a piece of broken pottery. The sight struck him as so ridiculous that he threw back his head and laughed. "Or what, old man? You gonna cook me to death?" The gang joined in the laughter, but it sounded forced now. Something in Cookie's stillness was making them nervous, though none of them could have said exactly what. Bull jerked Clara closer, his other hand moving to grab her chin and force her to look at him. She struggled weakly, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't." That was when Cookie moved. Not fast, not dramatically, but with a purposefulness that cut through the laughter like a blade. He simply walked across the kitchen, stepping through the mess of food and broken glass, and placed himself directly between Bull Morrison and Clara. "Step back, son," Cookie said quietly. Bull looked down at the old cook, standing barely shoulder-high to his massive frame, and his grip on Clara tightened. "You want her, old man? You're gonna have to go through me." Cookie nodded as if Bull had just confirmed something he'd suspected. "That's what I figured you'd say." He glanced at Clara, his expression gentle despite the hardness that had crept into his eyes. "Clara, honey, you go on into the main room now. This kitchen ain't safe for young ladies anymore." Bull laughed again, but the sound was uglier now, with an edge of hysteria. He shoved Cookie hard with his free hand, sending the old man stumbling backward into his own cooking counter. The wooden edge caught Cookie in the small of his back, and he grunted with the impact. "How's that feel, grandfather?" Bull snarled. "Ready to show some respect now." Cookie caught himself against the counter, and when he straightened, every man in that kitchen could see that something fundamental had changed. His stance was different now, balanced like a man who'd spent years expecting violence from any direction. The tremor was completely gone from his hands, and those pale blue eyes had gone flat and deadly as a winter sky before a blizzard. Frank Gunner, the youngest of the gang, took an unconscious step backward. His hand drifted toward his gun, then stopped as he realized he wasn't sure why he was reaching for it. All the old cook had done was stand up straight. But somehow, Frank found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories of the cavalry scouts who'd fought in the Indian Wars. Men who could kill with anything they could get their hands on. Men who moved like shadows and struck like lightning. Men who looked exactly like they had nothing left to lose. Just like the old cook was looking right now. Bull Morrison studied Cookie's changed stance with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up unexpected prey. The old man was standing different now, and Bull didn't like surprises. His solution to things he didn't like had always been simple and direct. "I think you need a lesson in respect, old man," Bull growled, rolling his massive shoulders. "Time somebody taught you your place in the pecking order." He drew back his arm and drove his fist toward Cookie's chest with enough force to cave in ribs. But somehow Cookie wasn't where the fist expected to find him. The old cook had shifted just slightly, turning his body so Bull's momentum carried him past his target. The big outlaw stumbled, catching himself against the stove with a look of confused rage. "Stand still when I'm hitting you," Bull roared, spinning around to grab Cookie by the shoulders. This time he succeeded, his huge hands clamping down on Cookie's thin frame like bear traps. He lifted the smaller man clear off his feet and hurled him backwards with savage force. Cookie flew through the air and slammed into the kitchen wall hard enough to rattle the entire building. But instead of crumpling to the floor like Bull expected, Cookie caught himself against the wooden planks with fluid grace. His boots touched down in perfect balance, and when he straightened, there was something in his movement that made every man in the room go quiet. In the main room of the trading post, pressed against the far wall where he'd been trying to make himself invisible, sat Ezra Blackwood. The old cavalry veteran had ridden with Custer before Custer got famous and stupid. He'd fought Comanche, Apache, and Sioux from the Rio Grande to the Powder River. His weathered face bore the scars of a dozen battles, and his hands shook with palsy that came from too many winters sleeping on frozen ground. But his eyes were still sharp as a hawk's, and when Cookie Martinez straightened up from that wall, Ezra saw something that made his blood run cold. "Wait," Ezra whispered, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. His rheumy eyes focused on Cookie's hands as the old cook slowly rolled up his sleeves. "Wait just a damn minute." Cookie's forearms, revealed as he pushed the fabric back, were a roadmap of violence. Thin white scars crisscrossed the weathered skin like a spider web of old pain. Knife cuts, dozens of them, layered over years of close-quarters combat. But it wasn't just the scars that made Ezra's breath catch in his throat. It was the way Cookie held his hands. Relaxed but ready, fingers slightly curved as if they were used to gripping weapons. And the calluses, thick as leather, in exactly the places where a man would develop them from years of throwing knives with deadly precision. "Sweet Mother of God," Ezra breathed, his voice rising with recognition and dawning horror. "Those scars, that stance. Cookie Martinez, you're the ghost of Apache Canyon." The name hit the kitchen like a thunderbolt. Frank Gunner's hand froze halfway to his gun. Jake Thornton's jaw dropped open. Even Skinny Pete stopped his nervous fidgeting and stared at the old cook with newfound respect and fear. Bull Morrison laughed, but the sound was hollow now, forced. "Ghost of Apache Canyon. What kind of fool name is that? You boys getting spooked by campfire stories." But Cookie was no longer looking at Bull. He was staring past him at Ezra Blackwood, and in his pale blue eyes was the weight of shared memories and old battlefields. "Hello, Ezra," Cookie said quietly. "Been a long time since Fort Henderson." Ezra Blackwood struggled to his feet, his arthritic joints protesting, but his back straight as a ramrod in the presence of a legend. 32 years, Sam. 32 years since you walked into that Apache camp alone and walked out with Lieutenant Morrison and his patrol. Thought you were dead." The gang was looking back and forth between the two old men like spectators at a tennis match. The name Morrison had caught Bull's attention, and his face had gone a shade paler. There had been a Lieutenant Morrison in his family tree, a great-uncle who died in the Indian Wars. Cookie slowly untied his flour-dusted apron and let it fall to the floor. Without the shapeless garment, his true build was revealed. Still lean, still aged, but there was a whipcord strength in his frame that the apron had hidden. And on his belt, partially concealed by his shirt, was a knife sheath worn smooth by decades of use. "Samuel Martinez," Ezra continued, his voice gaining strength as the memories flooded back. "Army scout, tracker, and the best knife fighter the frontier ever produced. They called him the Ghost because he could move through Apache territory like smoke. Called him the Ghost of Apache Canyon because that's where he earned his reputation." Cookie's hand drifted to the knife at his belt, and the gesture was so natural, so practiced, that it was like watching a man breathe. The blade that emerged was no kitchen utensil. It was a fighting knife, 8 inches of carbon steel with a worn leather grip shaped by years of faithful service. The metal gleamed dully in the lamplight, and along the fuller were tiny notches. 23 of them, one for each life it had taken. Bull Morrison was staring at the knife with the fascination of a mouse watching a snake. "That's just some old pig sticker," he said, but his voice had lost its bluster. "Don't mean nothing." Ezra Blackwood shook his head slowly. "That blade carved through the Comanche Wars, son. I watched Sam here take on 4 Apache warriors at once in hand-to-hand combat. Watched him win. He saved my life twice, saved Lieutenant Morrison's entire patrol, and probably saved a dozen settlements from being wiped off the map. Cookie tested the knife's edge with his thumb, and a thin line of red appeared on his skin. The blade was still razor-sharp after all these years. He looked up at Bull Morrison and his gang, and when he spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the mild-mannered Cook. In its place was something flat and cold and absolutely certain. The name's Samuel Martinez. Boys, Cookie said quietly. Most folks called me Sam, but the Apache had another name for me. They called me He Who Walks with Death. I spent 15 years in these territories, and I put 23 men in the ground. All of them needed killing, and all of them thought they were tougher than they were. He took a step forward, and even though he was still outnumbered 6-1, every man in that room took a step back. I retired because I got tired of violence, Cookie continued. Tired of watching young men die because they thought being fast with a gun made them dangerous. Tired of explaining to widows why their husbands weren't coming home. But some things you never forget, and some skills you never lose. The kitchen knife spun once in his hand, a casual gesture that nonetheless demonstrated perfect control. Frank Gunner swallowed hard. Jake Thornton's hand drifted away from his gun as if it had suddenly become too hot to touch. Now, Cookie said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, you boys picked the wrong cook to push around. You hurt that girl, destroyed my kitchen, and threatened innocent folks who never did you any harm. That makes this personal. Bull Morrison looked around at his gang and saw uncertainty in their faces for the first time since they'd ridden together. The old cook had transformed before their eyes into something altogether more dangerous. Something that belonged in the old stories their grandfathers told about the frontier wars. You're bluffing, Bull said, but even he could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. Just trying to spook us with old man stories. Cookie smiled for the first time since they'd entered his kitchen. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Tell you what, son, Cookie said, balancing the knife on his fingertip with casual precision. You and your boys walk out of here right now, and we'll call this a misunderstanding. You stay, and you'll find out whether these are just old man stories or not. The silence stretched out like a held breath. In the main room, Clara Whitman watched through a crack in the door, her heart pounding. Ezra Blackwood stood at attention despite his age and infirmity, ready to back whatever play the ghost of Apache Canyon was planning to make. And in the kitchen, 6 armed men faced one aging cook with a knife, and somehow the odds didn't feel like they were in the outlaw's favor anymore. Bull Morrison's face twisted with rage and disbelief. He'd built his reputation on being the meanest, toughest outlaw in 3 territories. The idea that some old cook could make him back down was more than his pride could stomach. Ghost stories, Bull snarled, his hand dropping to his gun. I don't care if you're Wyatt Earp himself, old man. Nobody talks to Bull Morrison like that. But Ezra Blackwood wasn't finished with his history lesson. The old cavalry veteran's voice cut through the tension like a saber through silk, each word precise and deadly. You want to know who you're facing, boy? Ezra said, his rheumy eyes fixed on Bull with contempt. That man right there tracked down the Bloody Hand Gang when they massacred the settlers at Willow Creek. All 7 of them. Found them holed up in Devil's Canyon and went in alone. Came out 2 days later with their scalps and the stolen gold. Cookie's expression never changed, but his grip on the knife shifted slightly. A professional adjustment that spoke of muscle memory honed by years of close combat. The Apache called him He Who Walks with Death because he could move through their territory like a ghost, Ezra continued. But the Comanche had a different name for him. They called him Stoneheart, because once he decided you needed killing, nothing in heaven or earth would stop him from getting the job done. Frank Gunner was backing toward the kitchen door, his young face pale as milk. The stories his grandfather had told him about the Indian Wars suddenly seemed a lot less like tall tales and a lot more like warnings. I remember Fort Henderson, Ezra went on relentlessly. Spring of 1861. The Lipan Apache had taken Lieutenant Morrison's patrol prisoner. 12 good men, including the lieutenant. Command was ready to write them off as lost, but Sam here volunteered to go in after them. Cookie's pale blue eyes grew distant, looking back across decades to a time when death had been his constant companion. He could still smell the smoke of Apache campfires, still feel the desert wind cutting through the canyon walls. Went in alone, Ezra said. No backup, no cavalry charge, Just one man with his knives and his wits. Found the Apache camp in Devil's Canyon, 36 warriors strong. They had our boys tied to stakes, getting ready for the morning torture. The knife in Cookie's hand seemed to catch the lamplight and hold it, the steel gleaming like captured starlight. Bull Morrison found himself staring at the blade with growing unease. There was something about the way the old cook held it that suggested intimate familiarity with its capabilities. Sam waited until just before dawn, when the guards were sleepy and the camp was quiet. Then he went to work. Started with the sentries. 4 of them, taken out so quietly their own mothers wouldn't have heard them die. Then he cut Lieutenant Morrison and the other survivors loose and armed them with the guards' weapons. Cookie flexed his fingers around the knife grip, and the gesture was unconscious, automatic, like a gunfighter checking his draw or a pianist warming up his hands. The fighting lasted maybe 10 minutes, Ezra continued. When the dust settled, 15 Apache warriors were dead, and Sam had taken a lance point in the shoulder and an arrow through his left arm. But all 12 of our boys came home alive. Every last one of them. Jake Thornton swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a cork on water. He'd been in plenty of fights, but they'd always been against farmers, storekeepers, and other soft targets. The old cook in front of him was something entirely different. That was just one mission, Ezra said, warming to his subject. There was the time he tracked down the Kiowa war party that took Martha Hendricks and her 2 daughters. Followed them for 3 weeks across country that would kill most men. Found their camp and got all 3 women back alive. Cost him a piece of his ear and some scars he still carries, but he got the job done. Cookie touched his left ear unconsciously, where a ragged notch showed white against the weathered skin. The old wound had healed decades ago, but the memory of the knife that had made it was still fresh. Then there was Adobe Wells, Ezra continued remorselessly. Buffalo hunters were holed up there, surrounded by 300 Comanche warriors. Command sent Sam in to assess the situation and report back. Instead, he spent 5 days picking off war chiefs and medicine men with that knife of his. Broke their spirit so completely they called off the siege. Bull Morrison's confidence was cracking like ice in spring. He'd built his reputation on intimidation and superior numbers, but the stories Ezra was telling painted a picture of a man who was beyond intimidation. A man who had faced impossible odds and turned them into victory through sheer skill and ruthless determination. How many men did he kill? Tommy Brennan whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. Ezra looked at Cookie, who nodded almost imperceptibly. 23 that I know of for certain, Ezra replied. All of them in fair fights or legitimate combat. Sam never murdered anybody, never shot a man in the back, never killed anyone who didn't have it coming. But when he decided someone needed to die, they died. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of 6 men breathing hard and 1 man breathing slow and steady. Cookie Martinez, the ghost of Apache Canyon, stood perfectly still in the wreckage of his kitchen, and somehow he seemed to fill the entire space. Bull Morrison's hand was still on his gun, but he hadn't drawn it yet. Something primitive in his brain was screaming warnings, telling him that pulling iron on this particular old man might be the last mistake he ever made. This is all ancient history, Bull said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. That was 30 years ago. Man gets old, loses his edge. Reflexes slow down, hands start shaking. Cookie smiled, and the expression was colder than a January wind. You think so, son? Why don't you test that theory? The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Bull Morrison found himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. He could back down, lose face in front of his gang, and spend the rest of his days wondering what might have happened. Or he could draw his gun and find out whether the ghost of Apache Canyon was as deadly as the stories claimed. Pride won, as it usually does with men like Bull Morrison. His hand flashed to his gun, a smooth draw that had served him well in a dozen gunfights. The Colt cleared leather clean and fast, the hammer coming back with a metallic click that seemed to echo through the kitchen. But somehow Cookie's knife was already in motion. The blade left the old cook's hand like a silver streak of lightning. It covered the distance between them in a heartbeat, and Bull Morrison's triumphant grin turned to a scream of pain and surprise as 8 inches of carbon steel punched through his gun hand and pinned it to the wooden support beam behind him. The Colt fell to the floor with a clatter, unfired. Bull stared at his impaled hand in shock, blood streaming between his fingers and dripping onto the debris-strewn floor. Cookie was already moving. Not fast, not flashy, but with the fluid economy of motion that comes from years of professional violence. His hand closed around a cast-iron skillet from his stove, and the heavy pan caught Jake Thornton in the temple just as the big man was drawing his gun. Jake went down like a felled tree, his Colt spinning away across the floor. Cookie spun the skillet in his hand and backhanded Frank Gunner across the jaw with it. The young outlaw's head snapped back, and he crumpled to his knees, spitting blood and broken teeth. Skinny Pete had his twin Colts halfway out of their holsters when Cookie threw the skillet at his head with devastating accuracy. The cast iron caught Pete square in the forehead, and he folded up like a house of cards, his guns clattering uselessly to the floor. Tommy Brennan and Charlie Vance were scrambling for the door, but Cookie was already between them and escape. He grabbed a heavy wooden ladle from the counter and brought it down on Tommy's wrist just as the outlaw's gun cleared leather. Bones snapped with sounds like dry kindling, and Tommy screamed as his Colt joined the growing collection of dropped weapons. Charlie Vance, the rifleman, had always prided himself on being smart enough to avoid close-quarters fights. But there was nowhere to run in the confines of the kitchen, and the old cook was moving through his gang like death personified. Charlie fumbled for the knife on his belt, his rifle useless at such close range. But Cookie was already there, inside his guard, one scarred hand clamping down on Charlie's wrist with grip strength that seemed impossible for a man his age. "I wouldn't," Cookie said quietly. His other hand produced a paring knife from seemingly nowhere, the small blade pressing against the pulse point in Charlie's throat. "Unless you want to find out how sharp I keep my cutlery." Charlie went very still, his eyes wide with terror. Around the kitchen, 5 members of the Morrison gang were down, disarmed, or disabled. Only Bull himself remained standing, pinned to the support beam by Cookie's throwing knife, his gun hand useless, and his face pale with shock and pain. Cookie looked around at the wreckage of his kitchen and the scattered gang members with the detached interest of a craftsman examining his work. Then he pulled his knife free from Bull's hand with a casual twist that brought fresh screams from the outlaw leader. Blood flowed freely from the wound, staining Bull's shirt and the wooden floor. But Cookie had been careful to avoid major arteries. The man would live, though he might never have full use of that hand again. "Now then," Cookie said, testing the edge of his knife against his thumb, "I believe we were discussing the terms of your departure from my establishment." Bull Morrison clutched his bleeding hand to his chest, his face twisted with pain and rage. Around him, his gang was scattered across the kitchen floor like broken toys. But Bull Morrison hadn't become the most feared outlaw in 3 territories by giving up when things got difficult. "You think you've won, old man," Bull snarled through gritted teeth. "But there's more ways to skin a cat than one." He jerked his head toward the kitchen door, where Clara had been watching the fight in terrified fascination. The girl gasped and tried to run, but Tommy Brennan, despite his broken wrist, lunged forward and caught her ankle. She fell hard, crying out as she hit the floor. Cookie's expression went flat as winter ice. The paring knife in his hand seemed to grow heavier, more substantial. He'd been willing to let the gang walk away broken and humbled. But threatening an innocent girl crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Let her go, Tommy," Cookie said quietly. "Last warning you'll get." Tommy Brennan's face was gray with pain, but desperation made him bold. He hauled Clara to her feet with his good hand and pressed her back against his chest, using her as a human shield. "How about you drop that pig sticker, old man?" Tommy gasped. "Or the pretty little thing gets her throat opened up." Cookie set the paring knife on his cutting board with deliberate care. His hands were empty now, but somehow that made him seem more dangerous, not less. He took a step forward, and Tommy pressed himself harder against the wall. "You don't want to do this, son," Cookie said. "There's still a way out of this where everyone goes home breathing." But Tommy was beyond reason now, driven by fear and pain into the kind of corner where desperate men make fatal mistakes. He fumbled for his boot knife with his broken hand, the blade shaking as he pressed it to Clara's throat. "Stay back," Tommy screamed. "I mean it, I'll cut her." Cookie's pale blue eyes went distant, looking past the kitchen to memories that were 3 decades old but still sharp as broken glass. He could see Apache Canyon as clearly as if he were standing there again. Could smell the smoke and blood, hear the screams of dying men, feel the desert sun burning his back as he moved through the enemy camp like an avenging angel. In his mind, he was 25 again, tracking a war party that had taken 3 white women captive. The Apache had thought they were safe in their canyon stronghold. They'd been wrong about that, just like Tommy Brennan was wrong now. Cookie moved, not fast, but with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche. His left hand caught Tommy's wrist, twisting the knife away from Clara's throat with surgical precision. His right elbow drove into Tommy's solar plexus, folding the outlaw over like a broken stick. Clara stumbled away, gasping. Tommy's knife clattered to the floor, and Cookie Martinez stood over another fallen enemy, his breathing steady despite the violence. But the fight wasn't over yet. Bull Morrison had retrieved his fallen colt with his left hand, awkward but functional. The gun wavered as he tried to aim with his offhand, but at close range it didn't matter much. He had Cookie dead to rights. End of the line, Ghost, Bull panted. 30 years too late, but justice catches up to everyone eventually. Cookie looked at the gun pointed at his chest and felt a familiar calm settle over him. He'd been in this position before, staring down the barrel of death with nothing but his wits and his will to live. It was almost comforting, in a strange way, like coming home after a long journey. You know what your problem is, Bull, Cookie said conversationally, not taking his eyes off the gun. You never learned the difference between killing and fighting. Bull's finger tightened on the trigger. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Cookie smiled, and the expression was genuinely warm for the first time since the gang had entered his kitchen. Killing is about hate, son. About wanting to hurt someone because they hurt you. But fighting is about protecting what you love. As he spoke, Cookie's hand had been drifting toward his belt, where a second knife hung in a worn leather sheath. Bull saw the movement too late to stop it. His attention focused on Cookie's words instead of his hands. The throwing knife took Bull in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his colt flying. He crashed into Cookie's spice rack, sending what few jars had survived the earlier destruction tumbling to the floor. Cookie was on him before he could recover, one scarred hand clamping around Bull's throat like a vice. The outlaw leader found himself lifted off his feet and slammed against the kitchen wall hard enough to rattle his teeth. Now you listen to me very carefully, son, Cookie said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow filling the entire room. I've killed 23 men in my life, and every single one of them gave me a better reason than you have. They were defending their people, their land, their way of life. You're just a bully who got too big for his britches. Bull's eyes bulged as Cookie's grip tightened around his throat. He clawed at the old cook's wrist with his good hand, but it was like trying to bend iron bars. I could kill you right now, Cookie continued. Would be easy as breathing. But then I'd have to explain to Clara why there's blood all over her workplace. Have to live with putting another man in the ground when there might have been another way. He loosened his grip just enough to let Bull breathe, but not enough to let him speak. So here's what's going to happen instead, Cookie said. You're going to take your boys and ride out of here. You're going to leave this territory and never come back. And if I hear about you bothering innocent folks anywhere between here and the Mexican border, I'm going to hunt you down and finish what we started here tonight. Bull nodded frantically, his face purple with lack of oxygen. Cookie held him against the wall for another few seconds, letting the lesson sink in, then released him. Bull collapsed to his knees, gasping and wheezing. Around the kitchen, the other gang members were slowly coming back to consciousness. Frank Gunner was spitting blood and broken teeth. Jake Thornton was holding his head and groaning. Skinny Pete was trying to focus his eyes after the skillet to his forehead. Cookie moved among them like a doctor making rounds, checking their injuries with professional detachment. None of them were seriously hurt, though they'd all be carrying souvenirs of their encounter with the ghost of Apache Canyon for weeks to come. Clara appeared at Cookie's elbow, carrying a wet cloth and a bottle of liniment. Her hands were steady now, though her face was still pale. Are you hurt, Cookie? She asked quietly. Cookie shook his head, accepting the cloth to wipe the blood from his knife. Just old wounds acting up, honey. Nothing that won't keep. But as he cleaned the blade, Clara could see his hands beginning to shake again. Not with age or infirmity, but with the aftermath of violence. She'd seen it before in her father, who'd fought in the war between the states. The trembling that came when a good man was forced to do terrible things. Through the batwing doors came the sound of approaching footsteps. The townspeople who'd fled when the Morrison gang arrived were beginning to return, drawn by curiosity and the sudden silence from the trading post. Ezra Blackwood was the first through the door, moving faster than his arthritic joints should have allowed. He took in the scene with a soldier's eye, noting the positions of the fallen gang members and the blood on Cookie's knife. "Is it over, Sam?" Ezra asked. Cookie nodded, sheathing his blade with the same practiced motion he'd used 1,000 times before. "It's over, Ezra. These boys have decided they've got business elsewhere." The other townspeople filtered in slowly, staying well back from the gang members who were helping each other to their feet. There was Sheriff Patterson, his deputy's badge gleaming in the lamplight. Martha Hendricks, whose general store provided most of the settlement's supplies. Doc Holbrook, black bag in hand in case there were injuries to tend. They stared at Cookie Martinez as if seeing him for the first time. The mild-mannered cook who'd served their meals and listened to their troubles was still there, but underneath they could now see the legendary frontier fighter who'd carved his name into the history of the Indian Wars. Cookie ignored their stares and began righting overturned furniture with methodical precision. The kitchen was a disaster, but it was his disaster, and he'd see it set right. Bull Morrison struggled to his feet, his shoulders streaming blood from Cookie's knife wound. He looked around at his broken gang and felt something die inside his chest. Not his life, though that would have been easier. His reputation, his power, his identity as the most feared outlaw in 3 territories. "This ain't over, old man," Bull said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Cookie looked up from where he was sweeping broken pottery into a dustpan. "Yes, it is, son. It's been over since the moment you walked into my kitchen and thought you could take what wasn't yours." The Morrison gang limped toward the door, supporting each other like broken soldiers retreating from a lost battle. At the threshold, Bull Morrison turned back for one last look at the man who'd destroyed everything he'd built. Cookie Martinez was back at his stove, adding wood to the fire to heat water for cleaning. He looked like nothing more than an aging cook tending to his kitchen. But Bull would never again be able to see him as anything less than death incarnate, patient and implacable and absolutely certain of his purpose. The batwing doors swung shut behind them, and the ghost of Apache Canyon went back to work. The batwing doors had barely stopped swinging when Cookie's hands began to shake in earnest. Not the theatrical trembling he'd affected as part of his disguise, but the deep, bone-rattling tremor that comes when a man's body finally acknowledges what his mind has been through. Clara noticed immediately. Her young face creased with concern as she watched the legendary ghost of Apache Canyon struggle to light the oil lamp with unsteady fingers. "Here, Cookie, let me help you with that," she said gently, taking the match from his scarred hands. Cookie nodded gratefully and sank into the old wooden chair by his stove. The adrenaline was leaving his system now, taking with it the supernatural calm that had carried him through the fight. In its place came the familiar weight of memory, the ghosts of all the men he'd killed rising up to remind him of the price of violence. "I'm sorry you had to see that, Clara," Cookie said quietly. "I spent 10 years trying to leave that man behind, and here he is again, blood on his hands and death in his wake." Clara finished lighting the lamp and set it on the table beside him. The warm glow revealed the true extent of the damage to the kitchen. Broken pottery ground into spilled food, overturned furniture, blood spatters on the wall where Bull Morrison had been pinned. It would take days to set everything right again. "You saved my life," Clara said simply. "Maybe save this whole town. I don't see anything to apologize for in that." But Cookie was lost in memories now, his pale blue eyes seeing not the wrecked kitchen but a canyon filled with Apache smoke and the screams of dying men. He could smell the cordite and blood, feel the desert sun burning his back as he moved through the enemy camp with his knife in his hand. 23 men, he whispered. 23 souls I sent to whatever judgment awaits us all. Some days I can barely remember their faces. Other days I can't forget them. Ezra Blackwood limped over from where he'd been examining the blood stains on the support beam. His old cavalry training had him checking the battlefield for signs of how the fight had unfolded, and what he saw impressed him even 30 years later. "Sam," Ezra said, settling into the chair across from his old comrade. You remember what Colonel Mackenzie used to say about necessary evils? Cookie looked up, focusing on the present with visible effort. That they're still evil, even when they're necessary. Exactly, Ezra nodded. But that don't make them any less necessary. Those boys were going to hurt innocent folks, starting with Clara here. You stopped them the only way they could be stopped. That makes you a protector, not a killer. Sheriff Patterson approached cautiously, his deputy's badge catching the lamplight. He was a young man, maybe 30, who'd taken the job because the pay was steady and the town was usually quiet. He'd never faced anything like the Morrison gang, and everyone in the room knew it. Mr. Martinez, Patterson said formally, I want to thank you for what you did tonight. This town owes you a debt we can never repay. Cookie waved away the gratitude with a dismissive gesture. Just did what needed doing, Sheriff. Nothing more, nothing less. But the townspeople who'd gathered in the main room didn't see it that way. They saw an old man who'd stepped up when their elected protector couldn't, who'd faced down 6 armed outlaws with nothing but kitchen utensils and an iron will, who'd risked his life to protect a young woman he barely knew. Martha Hendricks pushed through the crowd, her gray hair disheveled from her hasty retreat earlier. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth, and her face was flushed with embarrassment. Samuel Martinez, she said, using his full name with the respect due a hero. I brought you some supplies from the store. Spices to replace what got broken, some tinned goods, whatever you need to get your kitchen running again. Cookie started to protest, but Martha held up a weathered hand. Don't you dare refuse this, Sam. Half the folks in this room are alive tonight because of what you did. The least we can do is help you clean up the mess. And clean up they did. For the next 2 hours, the entire population of Red Rock worked together to restore Cookie's kitchen. Men carried out the broken furniture and brought in replacements. Women swept up the debris and scrubbed the bloodstains from the floor. Children fetched water and carried supplies. Through it all, Cookie sat in his chair and watched with wonder. He'd spent so many years trying to fade into the background, to be just another aging drifter with no past worth mentioning. But these people had seen who he really was, and instead of fearing him, they'd embraced him. By midnight, the kitchen looked better than it had in years. New shelves held carefully organized spices and supplies. The floor gleamed with fresh scrubbing. Even the old stove had been cleaned and polished until it shone like new. Clara was the last to leave, pausing at the kitchen door with obvious reluctance. Cookie, she said softly, will you teach me? Teach you what? Honey, Cookie asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. How to defend myself, Clara replied. How to fight back when men like Bull Morrison come around. I never want to feel that helpless again. Cookie studied her young face, seeing the determination beneath the fear. She reminded him of himself at that age, angry at the world's injustices and determined to do something about them. Fighting's not something you learn from books or lessons, Clara, Cookie said gently. It's something that gets carved into your soul, piece by piece, until there's not much left of the person you used to be. You sure that's a price you want to pay? Clara nodded without hesitation. If it means I can protect myself and the people I care about, then yes. I'm sure. Cookie sighed and stood up from his chair, his joints protesting after the night's violence. All right then, he said. We'll start tomorrow. But we do this right, with proper weapons and proper training. I won't have you getting yourself killed because you learned bad habits. The weeks that followed brought a peace to Red Rock that the town had never known before. Word of the Morrison gang's defeat spread quickly through the territory, along with the story of the mild-mannered cook who'd turned out to be a legendary Indian fighter. Other outlaws gave the settlement a wide berth, unwilling to test themselves against the ghost of Apache Canyon. Cookie resumed his quiet routine of cooking and cleaning, but now the townspeople treated him with a respect that bordered on reverence. Children would sneak into the kitchen just to watch him work his knife through vegetables with surgical precision. Men would linger over their coffee, hoping to hear stories of the frontier wars. Clara proved to be an apt student in the arts of self-defense. Cookie taught her how to throw a knife with deadly accuracy, how to use everyday objects as weapons, how to read the signs that warned of impending violence. But more importantly, he taught her when not to fight, when words and wisdom could accomplish more than steel. 3 months after the confrontation, Cookie was preparing the evening stew when Sheriff Patterson burst through the kitchen door with news that made the old cook's blood run cold. Sam, Patterson gasped, out of breath from running. riders coming in from the north. Maybe 20 of them, armed and looking for trouble. The leader's asking for you by name. Cookie set down his knife and wiped his hands on his apron with deliberate slowness. He'd known this day would come eventually. Men like Bull Morrison didn't simply disappear into the wilderness. They regrouped, gathered allies, and came back for revenge. You know who it is? Patterson asked. Cookie nodded grimly. Bull Morrison. He's come back to finish what we started. But as the riders approached the trading post, Cookie realized he'd misjudged the situation entirely. The man in the lead wasn't Bull Morrison, but someone much older, with steel-gray hair and a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Behind him rode a posse of legitimate lawmen, not outlaws seeking revenge. The marshal dismounted and approached the trading post with the measured stride of a man accustomed to authority. When he pushed through the batwing doors, his eyes immediately found Cookie behind the kitchen counter. Samuel Martinez, the marshal said formally. I'm Marshal William Hayes, Federal District Court. I'm here about the Morrison gang. Cookie tensed, his hand drifting instinctively toward his knife. If you're here to arrest me for what happened 3 months ago, Marshal, I'll come along peacefully. But I won't apologize for protecting innocent folks. Marshal Hayes smiled and shook his head. Arrest you? Hell, Sam, I'm here to thank you. Bull Morrison and his gang have been on our wanted list for 2 years. Murder, robbery, assault on federal officers. There's paper out on all of them with a total bounty of $8,000. He reached into his vest and produced a thick envelope, setting it on Cookie's counter with a solid thud. That's your share of the reward money, Hayes continued. Morrison's been talking his fool head off ever since we caught him, trying to make a deal. Told us all about how you took apart his whole gang with nothing but kitchen utensils and an old fighting knife. Made quite an impression on him, I'd say. Cookie stared at the envelope without touching it. What happened to them? Morrison and 2 others are going to hang for murdering a family of homesteaders up in Montana, Hayes replied. The rest got 10 to 20 years in Yuma Territorial Prison. They won't be bothering anyone again. The marshal tipped his hat respectfully. The frontier's a little safer tonight because of what you did here, Sam. The federal government thanks you for your service, both past and present. After the marshal and his posse rode out, Cookie sat alone in his kitchen with the envelope of reward money on the counter before him. $8,000 was more than he'd ever had at one time in his life. Enough to buy his own place, maybe start a small ranch, live out his remaining years in comfort. But as he looked around the kitchen that had become his battlefield and his sanctuary, Cookie realized he already had everything he needed. The years passed quietly after that. Cookie continued to cook and Clara continued to learn, their bond deepening from teacher and student to something approaching family. The trading post prospered under their care, becoming known throughout the territory not just for good food, but for fair dealing and honest hospitality. Cookie never spoke of his past unless asked directly, and even then his answers were brief and modest. But sometimes, late at night when the work was done and the guests had gone to bed, he would tell Clara stories of the old days. Not the violent tales that men told in saloons, but quieter stories about the friends he'd lost, the places he'd seen, the lessons he'd learned about courage and sacrifice and the price of peace. On his 70th birthday, the people of Red Rock surprised Cookie with a celebration that brought tears to his eyes. They'd commissioned a plaque for the kitchen wall, simple bronze letters that read, Samuel Martinez Cook, Protector, Friend. In smaller text below, he served this community with honor. Cookie protested that he didn't deserve such recognition, but Clara silenced him with a look that brooked no argument. You've spent 30 years trying to hide from who you are, Cookie Martinez, she said firmly. Maybe it's time you started being proud of it instead. And perhaps for the first time since he'd hung up his guns and traded his cavalry scout uniform for a cook's apron, Samuel Martinez allowed himself to feel something approaching pride. Not for the men he'd killed or the violence he'd done, but for the life he'd built in the aftermath. For the community he'd protected and the young woman he'd helped grow strong. As the sun set over the Red Rock trading post, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cookie Martinez stood in his kitchen and felt something he'd thought lost forever. Peace. Not the fragile peace of a man hiding from his past, but the deep, lasting peace of a man who'd found his place in the world and made it better by being there. If this story of standing up to bullies and finding peace after violence resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who thought they could push you around? What did you learn from that experience? Hit that like button if you enjoyed Cookie's journey from legendary fighter to humble cook and back again. And subscribe for more tales of courage, redemption, and the strength that comes from protecting what matters most.